Hey everyone, in this video let's take a look at the encoding hint property of the tabular model such as Power BI or SQL Server analysis services. So whenever you load data from a data source, either Excel or a database, the engine has to finally compress the data and it can either apply the value encoding or the dictionary encoding. And in this video we are going to understand how we can provide a better hint so that the engine might use the encoding that we are trying to suggest, because we can understand the kind of data that we are going to finally provide and load inside either SQL Server analysis services or Power BI. And first of all, what we are going to do is create a very basic table. So I'm already inside Power Query. So I'm going to create a list that will only contain, let's say, 5 values. So I can create a list out of that. If I click outside, you can see that I have a list. Then we can convert that into a table. So let's click on OK. And the data type will be a whole number. And what we can do is simply click on close and apply so that the data can be loaded. And now we can launch DAX Studio so that we can identify the kind of encoding that the engine has decided for that particular column. And for that, we need to go to the advanced tab, click on the view metrics option, and let's minimize everything. So you can see that in the encoding column, we see value encoding. So basically there are two major encodings that the engine can try. The first one is the value encoding. The second one is the dictionary encoding. And whenever you see the value encoding, you can know that the engine has tried to identify some mathematical relationship between the values of that particular column so that it can reduce the overall size that particular column is going to consume on the RAM. And in case of dictionary encoding, the engine is going to create a dictionary which will contain the unique values of that particular column as well as an index column. And instead of storing the actual value in the data, in the column, in the data model, it will simply store the pointer to that dictionary. So it will only store the index values and not the actual values. So the value encoding is generally applied on the numerical columns, and the dictionary encoding is generally applied on the text column or the columns which might contain some values between which the engine is not able to find out mathematical relationship. So let's say your column contains an outlier which actually breaks the value encoding, and in that case the engine will actually not use the value encoding and will simply use the hash encoding. And what we can do next is try to modify this encoding by going into the tabular writer, and inside tabular writer we have a property of encoding hint. So I've already opened tabular writer and I can refresh the data model. So you can see that we have this query. If I select this column and go to the view properties option, in the encoding hint you can see that right now it is default. So default basically means that whatever the engine finds suitable can be used as encoding. But in the drop down, we have hash encoding and the value encoding. Right now, the engine is using the value encoding. So let's try to switch to the hash encoding and we can commit the changes to the data model. After that, we need to do a full refresh of the data model. So let's go back to Power BI and I can click on refresh data. So the data has been refreshed. So we can go back to DAX Studio. And if I click on the view metric, so you can see that this time in the encoding column, we are showing the hash encoding for that particular column. So that means the engine has decided to use the encoding hint that we have suggested with the help of tabular writer. And now we can simply go back to tabular writer and switch it back to the value encoding because we need to move on to the next example. So let's commit the change, need to go back to Power BI, perform a full refresh. And let's go back to DAX Studio, click on view metric. And now you can see that we are back again to the value encoding. And let's say we go back to Power Query and we can add a new value in that list that will actually break the value encoding. So let's go to the source. And what I'm going to do is try to add a value that is going to be an outlier for that particular column. So let's write 9 multiple times. So if I click outside, go to change type, you can see that we have 1 to 5 and multiple 9s. So let's click on close and apply. And if I go to DAX Studio and click on view metric, before that you can see that we have the value encoding. If I click on view metric, this time the engine has actually switched to the hash encoding. So why is the engine shifting from the value encoding to the hash encoding? And the reason is that we are trying to load a value in that particular column that cannot be compressed and stored with the value encoding and the engine is not able to identify any mathematical relationship between the values of that particular column. So that's why the engine has decided that even though we are providing a value encoding hint in the tabular writer, it is going to use the hash encoding because that is the only way that particular column can be compressed on the RAM. So when should you use the hash encoding hint instead of using the value encoding? I would say that, let's say you are working with a database of billions of rows, and let's say that database is segregated into 100 segments. So let's say by the time the engine has read 90 segments and has already compressed those segments, the engine has decided to use the value encoding depending upon the values of that particular column. But let's say in the 91st segment, suddenly a value appears that is not suitable for the value encoding, and the engine has decided that it needs to use the hash encoding. So in that case, the engine will restart the process of compressing that particular column. So the value encoding will be discarded and the engine will reapply the hash encoding on all the segments, even though the 90 segments were already read and compressed. So you can see that in case it took a lot of time to load the data and compress it, then the engine will have to restart the process of compressing it, and then you will actually waste a lot of time in recompressing that particular column. And this particular process is also known as re-encoding. So in case if you know that in your database you might have some values that will actually break the value encoding, then you can use tabular writer to provide a suggestion to the DAX engine to use a particular encoding. And that was all for this video, and I will see you in the next one.